Hello. Hello, my dear friends. Hello, DLD community. Welcome to our DLD Sync afternoon today. How are you? I wish I could see your faces. I wish I could smell you and also touch you. It's not possible, but DLD Sync might be an interesting alternative. You are so many looking at me. I'm almost blushing because it makes me nervous, but it's not on me. It's on two outstanding speakers at DLD Sync. It's just like at the DLD conferences, we are taking an interdisciplinary view with this today. Today we have two artists because Hans Ulrich, you are also an artist. Two men who are changing our perspectives, not only as a zeitgeist momentum, but for decades. For decades. They both are change geist people. Both are humanists. Both are thinkers and brains. Sometimes it's not correlated. Thinkers, okay, but brains, but this is together. They are seismographs of the fundamental change we just experienced. Not only with COVID, also before. We in times of extreme change. And therefore, we need voices who think different, who take us on their journey, on their journey to learn from them, to experience their experiences, and to laugh with them, and to be with them. So let me welcome today Hans Ulrich. Hans Ulrich is not only the artistic director of the Serpentine Gallery in London and one of the world, not one of, the world's most influential curators. He's an integral part of DLD, of our communities of speakers and guests and friends. A long-time DLD art curator, as well as an outstanding connector and a good friend of mine. Here, let me thank you, Hans Ulrich, for all your enormous inspiration and love, what you give us. Thank you so much. Hans Ulrich is connecting us today with, there on my text, there's a musician, but Brian Eno is much more than a musician. He is a connector. He is a connector with art. He is an explainer of our society. He is always on top of the change. As I said, he is not zeitgeist. He is decadegeist, epochgeist. He is influential for my generation in music, of course. But this is not enough. He's a miracle, as Hans Ulrich always says. Hans Ulrich, let's start. Please introduce Brian. But before you introduce him, let me do something what I never do. Sing for him, because it's his birthday today. Happy birthday, dear Brian. Happy birthday, and a wonderful day, a wonderful year. Lots of friends, lots of good food, lots of food for thought. Everything what you wish, I wish you too. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steffi, and thank you so much, Brian. And indeed, a very, very happy birthday to Brian Eno. I'm grateful to Steffi for bringing us once more together, as DLD always does, bringing the disciplines together, going beyond the fear of pooling knowledge, going beyond the silos of knowledge. And when Steffi rang me about 2 weeks ago, telling me about this great new series Steffi, Yossi, and DLD are doing online of conversations, I immediately told Steffi we urgently have to have a conversation with Brian. And of course, it has a lot to do with our current collaboration also. We've known each other for 25 years, but the collaboration has never been more intense than right now, because we're working on this big project for the Serpentine, Back to Earth. We're going to talk about that today, because it has to do really with your involvement with society, with activism, with ecology, your fight against extinction. So that will be one of the topics. But I wanted to begin actually with a music-related question, because when the lockdown started to happen in London, and actually the first day I felt very anxious. I listened the whole day to your album. Actually, you did with your brother, with Roger Eno, and it's the first album you've done together, and it follows really a collaboration from 37 years ago, which is extraordinary. Also, the Apollo's Atmosphere, that was a soundtrack. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about that, because it really is a record. I mean, you did it before the current crisis, but it is a record for this very moment. It's extremely calming.
Yes, what a nice coincidence. It came out at just the right time, really. So the record started with my brother, who's always writing pieces of keyboard music, and he would often send me a new piece that he'd worked on. And I started thinking, if he gave me the MIDI files of these, I could change the sounds a little bit. He generally was working with a kind of rather cheap sounding electronic piano thing. And I thought I could really make a difference to these if the sounds were improved. So that's how it started, with me just wanting to give him the benefit for these lovely pieces he writes of some better instruments. And then it became a little bit more involved in that than that. But we did this for 15 years or so. And it wasn't until last year when I was thinking, you know, these pieces by Roger are really lovely. I should put some together so that some filmmakers might want to listen to them. And I put a whole group of them together, and suddenly I thought, this is a really good album. I hadn't ever thought until that moment that it could actually be a finished piece of work. So in fact, it was a very easy album to make, because it was finished at the very moment that I thought this could be an album. There was nothing more to do, really, or hardly anything more.
And it connects a lot to nature, to natural phenomena. During the lockdown, we were allowed in London to go on a walk every day. So I spent a lot of time in the park. As the poet Ethel Adnan says, a day without seeing a tree is a wasted day. I also started actually to do conversations with animals. I began to join TikTok, and I ask animals every day this question about their unrealized projects. This wonderful book by Vincent Desprez, which I really recommend.
What is
it's an extraordinary book. It's called What Would Animals Say If We Ask the Right Questions? And Bruno Latour said it's a new genre of scientific fables, actually, which doesn't mean science fiction or false story about science, but true ways of understanding how difficult it is to figure out what animals are up to. And so I was listening to your album and going on these walks, and there is a lot of natural phenomena in it. There is the desert, there is the sand, but there are also colors. So it's in a way a sound painting and a natural landscape. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, I've always said that contemporary music, that's to say music that comes out of recording studios, is in a way much more like painting than like traditional music. So in the, I'd say the 1890s, a revolution started and a new form of art was born, basically. And it was still called music. It shouldn't have been called music. There should have been a new name for it, actually. The things that you do in recording studios and the things that you make in studios are really quite different from the things that you would do with a classical composition and a classical way of making music. And so I thought that there should be a new name for it. You know, when theatre was filmed and became films, we didn't call that theatre. We don't say, I'm going to the theatre to see Ben-Hur. We say, I'm going to the cinema. I'm going to the movies. We have a different name for that. We really need a different name for this new form of music. I have my own name, but it's a terrible name. So I don't know.
Can you tell us?
It's called Nusic, spelt with an N. N-U-S-I-C, Nusic. It sounds like a sort of, I'll just write it down and hold it up so you can see it. This is, where are we? Can you read that?
Yeah, I make a photo. Wait, this is great.
It's got my address as well on it. Hold on, I'll cover that up.
We all make pictures.
But yes, it sounds like a product made of plastic, doesn't it? Music. I quite like it. But in my mind, I think that we should really be thinking about this art form quite differently. It's made differently. It uses different materials. It is listened to differently and in different places and in different ways, you know. So it really bears very little relationship, except for the fact that it comes in via your ears. But it's no more like traditional music than cinema is like traditional theatre. Anyway, so this this approach to making music, the thing that has really interested me is the fact that people now are completely intuitively comfortable with the fact that music is something you take to your life, you put into your life. It's in the past, well, I remember reading years ago a biography of somebody who lived in the 19th century, and it said in the biography he was very happy that in his lifetime he had managed to hear Beethoven's Fifth Symphony 7 times. Now, that was a lot of times to hear a piece of music then. Nowadays, we can hear that 7,000 times if we wanted to. So this idea that music is no longer linked to time or to location, is no longer fixed to those things, is sort of a new idea. And I think composers are still really coming to terms with that idea. It's of course, it always happens quicker in pop music than in art music, which doesn't kind of get the point immediately. Pop got it very quickly because it embraced the 45, the single. And the single was this sort of little message to the world, 3 minutes of something. In fact, even less than 3 minutes. I have a single that's 1 minute and 38 seconds long. Stay by Morris Williams. It was a #1 hit. And it's 1 minute and 38 seconds. That's so economical, isn't it, to change the world in such a short time.
And talking about music, you also told me in a previous conversation about the importance of generative music, and that you see generative music as somehow a model how actually society or politics could work. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. So first of all, I'll try to explain what generative music is. That was a name that I came up with about 30 years ago now, I guess, for the idea of music that was made by some kind of system. So the composer's job was to design that system that created the music. Now, system makes it sound more complicated than it should, or more limited than it should. To give you a couple of examples of what I would call generative music, the Terry Riley piece in C was a great moment in generative music history. That's a piece that has, I think, 52 bars, all in the key of C, and all at the same rhythm, tempo, I should say. And it's for any group of players, and each player starts at bar 1, but then moves on to bar 2 when they feel like it. They keep playing bar 1 over and over until they feel like moving to bar 2. And that way they work their way through the piece. So at the beginning, everybody's playing exactly the same thing. Gradually, different bars are superimposed on each other. And of course, so in the middle of the piece, there are, maybe 25, 30 different bars of music all playing superimposed on top of each other on different instruments. So what that means is that the piece is unpredictable. No performance of it will ever sound like any other performance of it. And it's very much unrepeatable, actually. You couldn't play it again like that. Nobody would remember what they'd done, who had changed when. So systems music is really the idea of creating a set of rules generative music, I should say, creating a set of rules which then make the music. So the composer's task is to design the rules, as it were, and then let the system carry them out. When I first started to become interested in this, so another very simple example of generative music is wind chimes. If you have a set of wind chimes, they're kind of limited in what they can do musically, but they do fulfill my basic definition of generative music, in that what they are is it's a little instrument that has a particular set of possibilities, and as the wind blows, it explores those possibilities. So I think you have to think of the space of a generative piece as being a sort of space of probabilities which are explored in each version, in each replaying of the piece. And it's been an important thread in contemporary music, I think. And interesting, the place that it has found the first really commercial home is in game design. So what used to happen with games was that each phase of the game, I'm talking about video games or computer games, each phase of the game had a kind of loop that went on. You got to that part of the game and that loop would come on, and then you got to another part and another loop would come on. I was asked in about 15 years ago or so, 20 years ago maybe now, to design the music for a game called Spore, which was made by the same guy who designed Sims. And I thought what would make sense is to have music that changed as each time you played the game, it evolved slightly. So that has now become quite a big idea in games design, game music design, that we don't just use lots of loops, but we have a sort of engine that is generative, that makes the music work. Now, why is this important? What difference does this make to anything? Which is what I always want to know about a piece of art. What difference does it make to anything? I think it makes two very important differences to our conception of what art can be. The first thing is this fact of it being unpredictable. So it relates to a lot of the things that have been happening in science, in complexity theory. It relates to the idea that a system, a complex system, is only describable by its own behavior. The description of the system is as complex as the system itself. There's no way of simplifying that description, shall we say. And I think more and more that's the understanding we're now starting to have about the world, that the map has to be as big as the territory to work. The second thing is that it changes what the notion of creativity is. If you imagine the traditional idea of what being a composer meant, what most people think, if you say I'm a composer, what they think you mean is that you've got a sort of symphony in your head somewhere, and it's all playing away in your head, and your job is to somehow write that down and get that thing realized in the world by getting people to play it, giving them scores, and suddenly the thing becomes real for the rest of the world as well. So by that account, the composer is sort of like an architect. They've got the building in their mind, and they've designed all the window frames and the door handles and the arches and everything like that, and then it will be built. My version of being a composer now, this generative music idea, is actually much more like being a gardener, where instead of having the whole thing in your head, what you have is a set of seeds and some expertise about how to create a situation in which they can grow. And the act of composing is the act of designing those seeds and designing the landscape in which they will occur. So that then, once planted, you sit back and listen. You watch the garden grow. And if you don't like the garden, then you change the seeds. You go back and you say, okay, I've got to design this differently. If you like it, you try to find out why you like it, why it worked, because the interactions are so complex sometimes of even 3 very simple rules, for example, and sometimes we're working with far more than that. But even with 3 rules, as in the famous John Horton Conway cellular automaton called the Game of Life, which, by the way, all artists should look at. I think every artist should know about this. It's old news in science, but it's still very exciting news, I think. Can I just, I don't know how many of your viewers will know about The Game of Life by John Horton Conway, but he died 2 weeks ago. And I think he was a great man, and I'm just going to write down The Game of Life. So if you haven't seen it, you should. And it's sort of to science. Hold on, where are we? John Horton Conway. It's sort of to science. It's like I don't know, Duchamp's urinal is to art, or something like that. It's one of those things that every scientist interested in complexity would know about. And it's such an important part of the conversation. And I think of understanding what the difference is now between how we think about our understanding of the world as opposed to how we used to think about it in the past. Anyway, sorry, I could go on about John Horton Conway for the rest.
No, I love this idea that we all, return to Conway. I think it's interesting, of course, because what you've said has a lot to do, brings us to what we want to discuss today about society and politics. Because, of course, this way of making music you described gets us away from this very top-down idea of an orchestra. And there was a very interesting collective document published called The Grey Briefing, actually written by a special circumstance intelligence unit by 90 futurists. And they basically looked at what would happen if the COVID lasted a year or more. And they figured out 3 scenarios. There's a pyramid scenario where basically government enact policies that benefit those who already have a lot, which will, result in exacerbated inequality, poverty, violence, and so on. The second scenario is the Leviathan scenario, where governments expand their powers and use them to deliver social goals and collective benefits. The scenario 3 is the village scenario, where ineffective, unsustainable states' responses will lead to fragmentation and very fragile DIY solutions. So the futurists came to the analysis that the second scenario, the Leviathan scenario, where everyone makes sacrifices and is mobilized to develop, local solutions, creating bottom-up experimentation with government support, government actually helping with that infrastructure, is the way to go. It will lead to a post-crisis recovery and result in a New Deal. So I've been looking a lot in the Roosevelt New Deal, what they did for art, and I think we need a New Deal, a New Deal for our time. In a similar way, Rifkin says the Green New Deal. I think we need a New Deal for the arts. And I was very interested, of course, because that has to do with our very first meeting, which was so premonitory, because we, about 6 months ago, came together in London and we invited you to do a show at the Serpentine Gallery. And we initially thought of showing your artworks, mainly your sound installations, also your conceptual works, and somehow maybe do a retrospective. And I always remember, it was actually last summer, it was a bit longer, it was about 10 months ago, that you rang me one morning and you said that it might be a very difficult conversation, but that you cannot do the show, and that you had a kind of an epiphany. And I think we should really talk about that, because it's extremely significant also in terms of what's happening now in the world.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, by the way, for finishing my last answer, I forgot to say that the important part of that connection was the implication that this way of thinking about organizing things really had a lot of social implications, and that's why it interested me. The idea that instead of being the architect, the person who designs everything in detail, you say, actually, that's not possible to do. The situation is far too complex. Only bottom up can deal with a problem like this. Only bottom up has the evolutionary agility to evolve the right answer. So yes, so the epiphany it happened around about my last birthday, actually. So nearly a year ago, I woke up a couple of mornings after my birthday, and I thought, I've probably got about 12 or 15 years left to live. I mean, it could be more, and it would be nice if it was, but I think I can count on 12 or 15 years. And that same day, I switched on the news, and there was a report from the International Climate Change Committee, and they said, we probably have 12 or 15 years left before we have to really, if we don't change in that time, then the planet is finished, really, at least for humans. And I was struck by this coincidence of the amount of time I have left in my life is probably about the same amount of time that the Earth has left in which to change its direction effectively. So I suddenly thought, I've got to take this on board. This is quite serious. And I'd been thinking about the Serpentine show, and I realized I was getting more and more unable to really countenance spending that amount of time doing something that was just about me and just about my work. And I thought, that isn't actually what I'm thinking about. You know, what I'm doing is I'm reading all the time, and I'm finding that there's this incredible new social revolution going on, which most of us don't know about. There's a feeling developing, and it's partly the feeling that I was talking about in the answer to the last question, the sense that the only way of creating complex enough systems to deal with the sort of future we might face is from the bottom up. It's not going to be designed by one person. It's going to be designed in the process of using it by lots of people, by everybody. And meantime, I'd been reading a lot of economics and other kinds of science, and starting to realize that there were people in all of these different disciplines who were kind of arriving at the same conceptual position, but didn't really know about each other. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice if everybody started talking, realizing that they were having the same conversation? This was partly inspired by a book I read. I've mentioned it, Hans Ulrich, many times, but it was a book about the end of the Soviet Union called Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More. I think the writer is a man called Sergei Yobchek, is it? I don't actually remember. But in that book, he talks about the critical moment in a revolution. He says that stage one is when everybody realizes something has gone wrong, something isn't working. Stage two, though, the interesting stage, is when everybody realizes that everybody else realizes the same thing. And at that moment, you have a kind of gelling effect. Suddenly the thing comes together. Suddenly everybody realizes they're having the same conversation. They might have a different dialect in which they have that conversation, but they're talking about the same ideas. So there's a big change going on. I think the biggest social revolution in human history at the moment. And we haven't really quite acknowledged it yet, but it's happening. And so I wanted the Serpentine show. I thought, rather than it being about me and my work, wouldn't it be nice if there could be a show that said, we're all in this thing together, lots of us. Let's start the conversation. Let's acknowledge it. And I didn't expect the Serpentine to be very interested in that idea, but I'm very happy to say they were. So thank you.
It was actually for us also an amazing revelation, because you made us really change the format and go beyond this idea of an exhibition. It was the beginning of the Back to Earth project, where basically following your inspiration, we invited 50 artists and practitioners from our fields to do an environmental campaign. And that, of course, is a campaign which can happen in the gallery, but it can happen also through social media. It can happen in public space. I mean, very important, this idea also that we go beyond the exhibition space, that we bring art into society very much. I think John Dewey, I think it's interesting to go back to John Dewey right now, the pragmatism particularly. He was, of course, also very inspiring for this whole New Deal projects. And Dewey always said we need to bridge art and society. So these campaigns go beyond the museum. And that's, of course, what we've been doing now since January, because we decided for the 50th anniversary of the Serpentine to look to the next 50 years and have these 50 campaigns. We actually launched one last week with Olafur Eliasson, where we looked at different perspectives on the planet and created after images. And then a big participatory campaign with Judy Chicago, Jane Fonda, who started the Fire Drill Friday, and Swoon, that is Create Art for Earth. And more than 6,000 artists are now participating in that. As a kind of an open, 6,000 artists over the last 2 weeks, and with the hashtag. And of course, also we do podcasts. We did a podcast with you. All of that is on the Serpentine social media and website. But one thing I wanted to ask you, Brian, is because to this first meeting, you brought us 2 books. And these will be actually my 2 next interviews after you. I'm going to speak to Kate Raworth, and I'm also going to speak to Mariana Mazzucato. And I think these 2 books are particularly relevant for this current moment of crisis in the world. Again, you told us about it a year ago, but now Kate Raworth has just been asked basically by the Dutch government. They take the book as a blueprint for the country. It's the Donut Economics. It's a book really which is an extraordinary blueprint for the 21st century. And then Mariana Mazzucato's incredible book about the entrepreneurial state, about debunking public and private sector myth. Again, a book which could be not more timely. Can you tell us a little bit about these 2 books and why they're such a toolbox?
Those 2 books are very important books for me, I think. They're both about the question of where does value come from and what is valuable, and how do we protect it? How do we nurture it? So in the case of the Mariana Mazzucato book, which was the earlier one of those 2, she takes on the myth that has fueled Silicon Valley, the idea of the sort of tech genius who suddenly comes up with the brilliant idea, the iPhone or whatever it is, and justifiably becomes incredibly wealthy because he's put this great idea out into the world. So she looks at these ideas and she sees where they actually come from. She traces them back. And of course, a lot of those ideas start with taxpayers' money. So those ideas really come out of the community, in the sense that it's the community that pays for them, often via the Department of Defense, actually. But the community taxes that's the money that pays for the long-term blue sky research, the kind of research that venture capitalists don't really particularly get interested in because it doesn't have a horizon to it. There's no payoff date. So she talks about this notion that knowledge, if you like, scientific knowledge, but also research knowledge, but also cultural knowledge, should be regarded as a kind of commons. And when somebody like, the implication of this is that when somebody like Bezos or Steve Jobs or a company become incredibly wealthy via their knowledge, they should say, we grew this out of the community and we will give something back to the community. I mean, that's what the idea of taxation is. The most shocking piece of news to me in the last few years about that was that Ed Sheeran, the English musician, paid more tax in the UK in 2018 than did either Amazon or Starbucks. Now, this has got to be a completely wrecked system for this to be the case. So this is about the source of value. Where does it come from? And what Mazzucato is saying is that we are all engaged in a huge kind of research and future building project. And we should not locate the rewards for that in the hands of just a few people. We should acknowledge that it's a more complex situation. What Kate is talking about, and it's very closely connected with Mariana's point, I think, is that traditional economics has always been about the things that we could put a price on. It's always been about the market. So we valued things that we could put a price on. That meant we didn't value, for instance, what used to be called women's work, being a mother, keeping a home together, caring for people. That all went unvalued. Of course, we still see the legacy of this in the NHS. You know, the people that we all agree are the most essential workers, the people we call essential workers, are nearly always the ones that we pay least. And they're nearly always women as well, actually. So this realization that caring is part of the social fabric, part of the ecology of a society, not just something that we don't bother about because it doesn't appear on the account sheets. That's one part of Kate Raworth's position. The other part is that the other thing outside of the donut is the environment, the resources that we've drawn on in the past as though they were infinite and as though they were owned by whoever happened to find them and stick a flag in the ground. Suddenly she says, no, we can't do that any longer. You know, the world can't continue to, sorry, my bloody phone is ringing. I switched it off and sorry.
No worry.
I find phones so disturbing. They kind of command your attention in a way. I'm sure if I used them more, I wouldn't feel that way, but I don't.
It's as Paul Chan says. Paul Chan says, to link is beautiful and to de-link is sublime.
That's lovely. Yeah, so Kate Raworth's book says that, okay, economics has in the past been about the sort of relationship of individual and state. And, you know, if you look at the spectrum, the capitalism to communism spectrum, one of them is individual capitalism and the other is state communism. And over the last 200 years, nations have situated themselves on different parts of that spectrum. You know, so you have Swedish capitalism or you have Chinese communism. There are different flavors. But what Kate says is that axis is in itself insufficient because it misses out two very important things. It misses out two things that fall outside of that axis. One is the environment and one is the home. The home is where the caring takes place. The home is where the future is built, actually. And the environment is where we get the resources to build it. So her book is very much linked with Mariana's second book, which is called The Value of Everything. So these two women, I think, are really creating a new picture of how society works and how we understand and estimate value.
And that, of course, brings us also to the last question I wanted to ask you before we then open it up to the questions we received, which is really to tell us a little bit more about the current moment. Both of these books are super relevant. I mean, the fact about care is so important. Care matters. The importance also, of course, of solidarity. Richard Sennett, you quoted him the other day,
yes,
saying that solidarity is a craft, that we need to think of solidarity as a craft. I just wanted to ask you a little bit to talk about how you see the current moment and how you see sort of the future of society in terms of a concrete, you know, an utopia, but a concrete utopia, as Jonas Riemann would have said.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's been very interesting in the last few weeks, of course, is that we've all been involved in this experiment that would have been absolutely impossible to create other than by means of a dangerous virus. We've all suddenly been discovering that we can live quite happily without a lot of the things that we thought were essential. Of course, I'm not ignoring the fact that a lot of people are suffering at the moment. My daughter, one of my daughters, is a doctor, so I know exactly what the medical consequences of this are, and I realize that also that people's businesses are crashing and so on. But I think what everybody agrees on is that a lot of the things we thought we needed so much around us turn out to be not so important. And we've had this now quite lengthy experiment in rediscovering ourselves in a certain way. It's like going on a retreat, you know, except the whole world has gone on a retreat. And I think it's very interesting what we're learning from this. We're learning that we can still have conversations. And in fact, we've been having a lot more of them. When there isn't anything else to do, we start talking again. I think we've started healing a lot of wounds as well. In England, we've had 5 years or so of really quite bitter political division, which became quite nasty in character, as indeed you've had in America as well. And it seems to me that this challenge that we've been given now has said to people, at last we have an excuse to be nice to each other again. We can bury those differences and we can start helping each other out. It's really interesting to me to see how suddenly people have gone into a cooperative frame of mind. They're not being political about it. They don't even necessarily realize that it's political, but it is. We've suddenly shifted into a sort of version of socialism. In fact, the most interesting thing is that the realization that as soon as countries are in a really difficult existential crisis like this, they almost inevitably have to become socialist countries. I mean, America is trying to hold out and not be socialist, but you know, America now has more deaths from COVID than any other country, and looks set to carry on in that direction. So their experiment is failing, as far as I'm concerned. They're trying still to, you know, do the market fundamentalist thing of letting the market solve the problem. Well, they'll find out that it won't. It won't solve the problem. Sorry, I've forgotten the second part of what you asked me.
But it leads me right away to the next question, which is really the first question here I want to take from our participants, because one of the recurrent questions we received here of all the questions, thank you, by the way, to everyone for all these great questions which are coming in, is about the role of art in the current moment. And of course, in this terrible crisis, we need to come together and support one another through art and imagination. So the question here is, do you agree that art is what really redeems us?
This is such an interesting question, and I've thought about this quite a lot. Now, art is a powerful tool of some kind, though we rarely seem to describe its power very well. But it isn't. It's like fire. It's not powerful necessarily for the good. It can be quite powerful and quite dangerous as well. So I always say, if art really redeemed us, then Himmler would have been one of the great people of the 20th century, because he had the most wonderful art collection, which he'd mostly stolen from Jews, by the way. So just having a connection to art, basking in the glow of art, doesn't make you necessarily a good person. So I have this argument because some while ago, I was involved in discussions with a couple of bands who thought that using art as a boycott technique in relation to Israel was bad because they felt that art was automatically good. They felt that the power of their art in that situation would be better than the consequences of making a boycott. As if art automatically radiates goodness into any situation. Well, I don't believe that. I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't believe that. I think it's a power tool, and how you use it matters. So now, how do I think it works? Well, unfortunately, we don't have very much time left for what I think is one of the most important subjects that anybody could talk about now. What we have a situation where everybody knows that somehow it's important, because, you know, why would every society that we know of develop art? We don't know of any human groups that don't have something that we would call art. So it clearly does something important, just like religion does, another thing that all human groups seem to develop. So I want to suggest, I think there are 5 different answers to this question. I'm just going to mention one of them right now, and that is, I will call it modeling. Now, everybody knows what modeling means in science. If you want to make a bridge, you make a model of it first, a mathematical model or even a physical model. You make a version of it in, if you like, in imagination. You imagine how that would be. That seems to me is one of the things that art does. It suggests a kind of reality to us, and it says, what would this be like? How would you feel about this? Here's a chance to explore your feelings about this possibility. Now, sometimes that's very explicit. You know, for instance, the book 1984 by George Orwell was a description of a possible society. And you could read the book and then you could think, ooh, I don't like that. How do we avoid getting to that place? That's a model that I don't want to see realized. So with literature, it's very clear how this works, or with cinema as well, both of them being narrative media. It's clear how that modeling function happens. But I think that modeling function is what happens through all the art that we experience. When we go and look at a picture, a painting, we don't see that painting in the absence of anything else. We see that painting in terms of our whole history of looking at paintings. And what we see are the differences that it has to that whole history. So we see, oh, it's very angular. It's very abrasive. It doesn't have this. It does have that. For instance, imagine what somebody looking at an early Mondrian felt in 1926 or something like that. What do you see? You see the absence of a lot of things. It doesn't have a figure. It doesn't make any allusion to anything that we're likely to see in the rest of our lives. It doesn't have ranges of colors. It has 3 colors. So all of those things suggest the possibility of another way of thinking about things. What happens if you leave out these possibilities? What happens if you add these possibilities? So I realize I'm trying to hurry this explanation because we don't have very long. But what I'm trying to say is that when we look at art, what we're really looking at is a proposition about a world. Same as when we listen to music. We listen to heavy metal and we say, this is so harsh. This is a harsh world. What do I like about that? Or when we listen to, the record I just made with my brother, this is a sort of pristine, very clear world, but with some sense of melancholy and doubt in it. Is that the world I want to be in? how do I get to that world? What do I like about it? What does it answer? What does it not answer? So this kind of modeling thing is one of the things that I think art does. And it's an important one. Right at the very beginning, you said that you enjoyed this album, this new album, because it seemed to fit this moment very well. Well, I think it fits this moment because it says, just calm down a bit. It sort of says, surrender to the moment. So surrender, I might mention, is what I think is one of the other of the 5 main functions of art. Learning to surrender. Can I briefly go into that?
Yeah, it would be wonderful. We have 5 minutes left, so plenty of time.
Okay.
It's also a great way. I think it's a great way to end. No, it's on this question of art and surrender.
Okay, so all of us Westerners, anyway, who've grown up in a technical civilization, a civilization that's been technical for maybe 5,000 years now, are used to the idea that our job as humans, our particular gift as humans, is to be able to control things, to control nature, for example, to be able to use fire, to be able to defend ourselves against wind and rain, and to be able to grow crops. All of these things are sort of elements of control, and we're very, very good at control, and that's why we're sitting here able to use these complicated technologies that we've evolved. We've learned to control certain things. Control is not always possible, however. There are many situations that we are going to find ourselves in which we can't control. And to navigate those, we need to be able to surrender. Now, surrender, to me, is an active verb. It isn't just, oh my God, I can't do anything, I'm paralyzed. Surrender is what hippies used to call going with the flow. Surrender is finding out how you can navigate the situation when you can't control it. Surrender is being able to flow with things. So I think one of the other things art does is it reminds us of this gift that we have for surrendering. Now, you have to remember that most of the things that humans really, really enjoy, that they don't have to do, that of course they have to do, you have to shit and eat and so on. There's some things you have to do, but then there's a whole lot of other things that you don't have to do. And those are the ones that we tend to call either sex, drugs, music, or art, or religion. Those are the places where we go to for transcendental experiences, actually. And the interesting similarity with all of them is that they're all situations where we put ourselves out of control, where we volunteer to surrender. We allow something to happen to us that takes us somewhere. You know, all the phrases, I got high, I was taken out of myself, it blew my mind. All these sorts of phrases are ways of saying I was no longer in control of myself. So I think the fact that we have such a taste for that, the fact that all of us in some way or another are looking for ways to get out of control, again, shows us that that might be an important thing for humans to keep doing. You know the kind of people who can't let themselves get out of control. They're fine in they're great in situations actually where control is the right response, but they're hopeless when they can't use that response. They don't know the other one. They don't know the flow. So I think one of the second thing I'd say art is doing after modeling is giving us the chance to rehearse our abilities to surrender. I won't start on number 3 right now.
But we can do that in the next part 2, hopefully, of this amazing conversation.
I'd love to do that. I'm always thinking that one day I'll do a talk that will last about 5 hours, where I go through this theory I have about the 5 different things that art does for us.
Let's plan it with Steffi and DLD, right, Steffi? We're gonna do a 5-hour talk.
I would love to have it. Brian and Hans Ulrich, you gave us a big gift with your talk. It's your birthday, but you made us a gift. Make us a gift. Thank you. I'm really so inspired and so enthusiastic about your humanistic thinking, about what really touched me was this 15 years time you have in mind regarding to help together to save our world.
Yeah.
How do we activate people? With this talk, you activate me. We really have to do this 5-hour talk, because I could listen to you forever, to the both of you.
Well, thank you.
I'm not choosing. I'm touched. Thank you for this.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Hans Ulrich. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Brian. Thank you to Steffi. Thank you all for listening and for joining and for your questions. And see you all very soon.
Brian, you are amazing.
Thank you.
And again, happy birthday to Brian. Happy birthday.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.